Welcome to ABA On Call with Rick Kubina and Doug Kostewicz. Explore insightful ABA discussions. Stick around for a chance to earn a CEU. Listen for 3 secret words, note them, and claim your CEU after the show. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to ABA On Call. Today, as usual, I am joined by my dear friend, my trusted co-host, Dr. Douglas Kostewicz. Doug,
I don't use that doctor. You don't need to do that. Just call me Doug.
Oh, I want to call you Dr. Doug.
Oh, it's okay. But thank you. I'm excited to be here today, as usual.
We're going to do something interesting today, which is you and I and maybe many other people have had exposure to a book that's quite influential in the field. It's called Strategies and Tactics of Behavioral Research. It's in its, 4th edition now?
Yes.
I've read the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd edition. I haven't got the 4th edition yet. So you may have read that 4th edition. But what's interesting about this book is it has changed quite a lot from edition to edition. And normally when books go through this upgrade, right, change the references, do whatever so you can get a new edition out and sell. But these chapters have been very much changed. But nevertheless, I will say that this is a very influential book.
It's so eye-opening, especially as you're thinking about doing behavioral research. The best I could use is this is the opposite of a cookbook. It dives in deep. It doesn't just have recipes for doing research. Here's all the wonderful rules and things to avoid. And if you do all those things, heck, you may come up with new designs. You may come up with new ways to do things, but it just dives deep into the engineering of behavioral research.
That's well said. I've taught single case design courses for many years, and I know other people that have taught single course design. And as you said, one thing that some folks do is they're like, okay, here's the 4 main experimental designs that we have, learn them, here's some articles, let's do some stuff, let's have some conversations. But this is so much more. One of the things that, and again, not having read the 4th edition, but the 3rd edition and the 2nd edition, but not in the 1st edition, they have these boxes. And these boxes are cute little takeaways where, and maybe cute's the wrong word, insightful takeaways. And what we're going to do this podcast is we're going to talk just about 3 of these. And we'll introduce it. And we'll reflect on it. And when I say that they're short, some of these are not even a page long. Some of these are like half a page, but they're profound. So why don't we start off with box 3.5, and it's called the Null Hypothesis Game. And why don't you introduce this for us, Doug?
So this box looks at the traditional psychological testing approach where you set up some hypothesis, and if your data supports that, great. If it's different than that, then there's a problem, right? It's you're supporting the null hypothesis. So the idea is, when we think psychology, often you get this notion it either is or it is not. It's either yes, this is the case, or no, it's not the case. And that's the goal of some of these research designs. And that the authors take a different spin on that when looking at behavior analysis and behavior analytic research. And if you have something to add there, that'd be nice.
Well, let's dive into, you talked about the null hypothesis, and we need to describe what it is. So the null hypothesis, null meaning nothing. There's no difference between the performance of the control and the experimental group. Now, we're talking about psychological research, and what's different from what we do single case design. we focus on an individual or individuals, and we look at how the person is a control for themselves. Whereas when you're looking at the group inferential statistical model or between groups model, you're looking at a control group who's not getting whatever the special thing is you're doing in the experimental group. And this null hypothesis says that there's no difference between these two things.
Right.
And then there's the alternative hypothesis, which says there is a difference. So when you were talking earlier, you were referring to what happens when you run this experiment. And with the null hypothesis, you're hoping to reject that null hypothesis so that you could say, hey, there isn't a difference, and you accept it. In the problem, one of the problems with, there's several problems with this. One of the problems is, as you alluded to, is it turns out to you just doing all of your science is saying yes, no, and you can find things out that way, but it's not the most efficient.
No, it's not. And when you do that, so when you set up these hypotheses, what you actually do is earlier in your research, you're trying to establish that how you're arranging your study or the theory behind what you're doing would lead you to, if there's a difference, this is why there's right. So you just want to know yes or no about that difference. What is very enticing and exciting to behavior researchers, as well it should be, is why are those differences occurring? What are those specific differences? And you can't get at that when you have two groups of people, because you can't get down to the individual anymore. Whereas when you're looking at single case, when you're using the individual as their own control, you can begin to look at where is that variability in the environment that's setting those differences in performance. Because we're hypersensitive, we're looking at individual instances of behavior, and we watch that change over time. And so
your talking made me think of, you came to the nub of the problem. And that is, if we're interested in individual differences, if we're using a group and taking then the average of that, we don't know anything about the individuals. We only know about the average. And this is where, if you're in psychology and you're applying this, you get all excited because, oh, you get to reject the null hypothesis. And the other thing, I guess, to talk about here for people that have done this research or that read this research is there is some probability level, the p-value is what it's called. And the p-value is typically set at 0.05, which means there's a 95% chance that the reason why you're rejecting the null is because of what you did. There's a 5% chance that this just happened randomly. But still, you're all going to give each other high fives, and you're going to congratulate one another and say, ooh, we get to reject the null hypothesis. We found something. We're contributing to the world. Again, I don't want to sound dismissive, but I am sounding dismissive. And you can understand things when you do this approach. I'm not going to just say, oh, it's worthless. If you want to know about differences between averages and groups, damn it, do this, because single case design is not going to give you that. But the real question is, if we want to understand behavior deeply and richly, this is going to have a lot of potential drawbacks.
Yeah, I think you need to remind the audience that you should be asking different questions using these different designs, because they come out with very different answers. It just so happens that as behavior analysts working with behavior of individuals, we need to be relying less on these yes-nos and be learning more about the specific differences that come into play. Because oftentimes, and this is, again, no discredit, we're worried about a client that we're working with. We need to understand what is directly affecting this individual's behavior. And we have those types of designs. We have different ways to look at them with and without the intervention. Then we begin to look at all the different variables that are affecting this. So it's it's asking a different question, and we learn so much more about our unit of analysis that we just don't play that null hypothesis game. We don't align our questions in that way. And if we do, we leave way too much information on the table. Because if you are a practitioner and you want to know, does this help children with autism? And you're going to look at all this data. You don't want to know, yes. You want to know, does this person appear like the individuals that these studies were done with? Is this person, are they in a situation where they can get an intervention like this? It's not a yes, no answer. It's very nuanced and very important at that individual level.
Well, I certainly can't top that. That is a very nice way to bring us to the end of the session. But I will point out, before I give a secret word, is you did the thing that I love when they do in Hollywood. You somehow worked in the name of this segment, which is the Null Hypothesis Game. So good for you.
Thanks,
And
man.
that means our secret word is null. And by the way, if you want to know how to spell it, it's Null. It's a weird name, null hypothesis. You don't hear a lot about it, but you all listening probably have heard about it because you understand. You probably had classes in psychology, but that is our first secret word.
Okay.
Okay, well, let's move on to our second segment. And this is called operational. This is a box that is in another chapter, and it's called Operational Definitions in Behavioral Measurement. And this next box is something that, rereading this, I had forgotten about this box before. I mean, there's so much in books that you read, and even if you read them multiple times, you can't remember all the details in them. And this is one, like, I've done a lot of work on operational definitions, and sure enough, Johnson and Pennypacker are talking about it, and there are many different interesting things in here. But let's just start off by saying, where they start their box, and that is explain to people what the heck is an operational definition. And an operational definition, the name of operational definition can help you remember what the heck it is. What operations are you using to measure something? Those operations that you use to measure whatever that thing is, that becomes the definition. And here's a simple example. Happiness. What is happiness? You can ask people, you can ask your mom and dad, you can ask your kids, you can ask your friends, your colleagues, whoever. People are going to give you different responses. But from a scientific standpoint, if we wanted to say, okay, I want to measure happiness, we could have some operation that might be, I'm going to count how many times you smile during this conversation. And when I count, the operation is me counting how many times you smile. That becomes the measure of happiness. Now, whether that's good or bad, that's another conversation. But I can say I measured happiness, and I can say, oh, guess what? I've measured happiness. And that's what an operational definition is.
And the big problem here is, what are you calling happiness? What am I calling happiness? What is someone else calling happiness? What if they're measuring laughs and you're measuring smiles? So you're both measuring happiness. We don't know. And I mean, there's bigger things here because we tend to, as behavior analysts, move towards very observable, measurable things, not to discount internal states and things, but we usually don't jump to that next level, right? We don't jump to saying that a smile is happiness. We measure smiles. They can be other things that are associated with that, and that's all well and good, but we don't jump to those internal states as other disciplines do. And so looking at operational definitions, we don't actually need those when you're measuring behavior.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. You hear but we use that terminology flying around all the time. What's your operational definition? It's technically not right. Just say you're measuring behavior.
Yeah. Well, you brought up a couple good points there. The one that I want to go back to, and this is a problem that we can turn the critical eye on behavior analysis. How many operational definitions have you seen for on-task behavior? And we can do this in
I
our
knew you
field.
were going to say on task.
Yeah, because it's the scourge of the world. On-task behavior. I wish I could ban it. We use it in behavior analysis. We use it in education. We use it in psychology. And there's so many different definitions in every article that has ever published. And I will admit that this isn't the pot calling the kettle black. So I'm disclosing this. I was like a third author on a paper where we did a study, we used on task, and you can find my name associated with that paper. I'm not happy about it, but you know what? It happened. Nevertheless, that doesn't mean I can't criticize the heck out of operational definitions. And in this notion that you brought up, which is every single person's going to do it differently, describe it differently. So what's the right one?
And that's so what in going back, you was bringing what we said before. We're looking at these differences at the individual level. We need to all be talking about the same thing. And so it's so much cleaner, so much more concise to get down to the lowest dimension of behavior that you're measuring. So it's clear, concise, and allows for the most understanding. It's all right. So I'm going to go off on a little tangent here, and I apologize. Operational definitions promote really poor data collection methods.
True.
So it becomes easier if I make a more encompassing definition, then I use discontinuous measurement, right? Then I use interval sampling, and it becomes what it feels like I'm getting more information about this individual, but what is happening is you're messing with so many different aspects. We're losing so much data by relying on these definitions that there is, even if there was full agreement on them, you don't need them. Yeah. It's like going to step 2 or step 3. Why not just stay at step 1? It's okay.
Yeah. They say in the box that these operational definitions are oftentimes nouns and we should be using verbs, which is exactly correct. If you're going to drill down and come to a behavior that you could count more precisely, behavior is about people doing things. Behavior is about action. You're going to capture that with verbs. You're not going to capture that with a noun.
I haven't seen too many people on tasking.
Right. But yet that's what we do. And same thing with like anxiety. How many people are anxieting? I didn't even say that right, but you're right.
I anxietied.
Yeah, there you go. You fill in whatever you want in there. These nouns just don't work. And as a result, this box that's talking about these issues, this is something that we all should be paying attention to. We should all be striving to figure out how can we do something better. The operational definition is, this is something I would want to point out now. I have done research on operational definitions, and what I don't want people to think is that all operationalism is bad.
Right.
Operationalism by itself is not bad. Like we do operate, like people say, oh, let's operationalize what you're doing over there. We do that every time we write up a methods section. When we have our methods, how are you operationalizing your experiment? That's fine. You can go to law, and people will operationalize what it means to have drug paraphernalia. There'll be this list that's encoded, and guess what? If you do one of those things that's in the law, you're breaking the law. Like you can't have this, and it's going to be different for say. Nevertheless, so we're not saying operationalism is bad. What we're saying is, we're not just us, but this box is saying we need to be cautious about operational definitions. for behavior.
And that also doesn't mean that you remove defining a response class. So if you've got some 4 or 5 topographical behaviors that are different, but you've determined that they're functionally the same behavior, it's okay to measure those and compile that together. What becomes difficult is when you just randomly take a bunch of behaviors, call it something, and then announce that that something, that operational definition, is the thing that's increasing or decreasing, right? So you can still collect data on a response class, and you can let someone know certain elements of that class are increasing or decreasing. You lose that when you go to that big operational definition in the sky versus identifying a group of behaviors that are functioning as the same thing, even though topographically they're different. So this is, we are very, this book, probably more than any other book, brings out my inner scientist, because that's just so, you can get down to such the nitty gritty, and it's so awesome. And I just, so don't think that we're dousing everything and throwing everything out. It's this idea of take a little bit more time as you're looking at what you're measuring, rather than relying on certain terms in the environment and grabbing their definitions and moving forward.
Yeah. This is a science. If we ascribe to being a full science of behavior, we need to have these arguments. We need to critically examine what we're doing. And if our feelings get hurt because of that, then you shouldn't be in the game of science, because this is, you're throwing elbows. You're out there trying to overturn things that aren't useful, or that that's just part of the game. So that comes with, and as you pointed out, this is, I feel similarly, this book is so impactful in talks of, we're just hitting one little box. And what's that box? I'm looking at it. It's maybe 2/4 of a page, and yet
it's about 20 sentences, right?
Yeah,
and that's one little nugget within a whole vein of awesome ore.
Yes.
So, all right. So that brings us to our second word, and that word is definition.
Okay. Well, let's move on to our third segment. And this is titled, What is Inside the Organism? And it's interesting when you look at how these chapters are set up, and you can almost see when these folks were writing this, like, oh, you know what would go really good here right about now is a conversation about X. And without going into this particular chapter is called Sources of Variability, which is something we all look to do and understand, because we understand that impacts behavior. And this is getting at what is inside the organism. So, Doug, why don't you tell us? I'm going to just throw this over. What's inside the organism?
Not a damn thing. We're hollow. That's it. Done. So
it's a tabular roster.
Yeah, right. So there are many different words and descriptions from a variety of fields that go inside, right? I'll just read a couple. They have things such as memory, intelligence, ability, ego, mind, compassion, wants, impulses, images, information, attitudes, inhibitions, virtues, etc., etc. And the focus here is, and I like to tell my students this, I think, don't dig inside. Don't dig inside. There are behaviors that are going on. There is internal states. It's folly to believe that people don't have thoughts and feelings, because we do, right? And Skinner talks about the self as a transducer of events. That's great. But when we're thinking about sources of variability, we need to be ascribing to those characteristics of science that are in the first frickin' chapter, right? Everyone's read the white books. What is one of them? It's parsimony. And when we go inside we violate the attitude of parsimony. We violate making more complex descriptors and explanations for what's going on rather than looking at, identifying, and finding these sources of variability in the environment.
It seems, if I want to say that's a life lesson, it certainly is a lesson for our field, and it's hard to escape it. It's so damn hard. I'm at the stage of life, Doug, where I have grandkids now. And when my kids were kids, my kids are now, at the time of this recording, they're in their 30s. And I can't remember a lot of when they were kids, but now that I have grandkids, I can look and see, and it's just so clear to me. Like my granddaughter the other day, we have cookie jar, and guess what? She knows what's in that cookie jar because, damn it, we spoil her. And I will admit that freely. And she'll say, "Oh, I'm hungry." And it's very easy, like for her or for other people, to say, "Well, why did she go in that jar?" Well, she said she was hungry. She knew there were cookies in there, so she walked over to grab a cookie. That's looking at why she did that. It's internal, and we could look at this logic train of, well, she said she was hungry. She knew, she has knowledge that there was this thing in here, and that drove her behavior that caused her to go over there because she was hungry to grab the cookie. We look at that very differently. I'm not going to explain that behaviorally, but you all who understand the principles of behavior analysis can look at that much more parsimoniously without us having to say she did it because of these internal events. But yet it's very challenging. And you and I and everyone else listening to this fall into this because when we talk to people, we're constantly using our language to describe these things that are going on inside. And we, the people that we love, our relationships, our colleagues, we're saying like, "Hey, how you doing today, Doug?" "Oh man, I just worked out. I'm tired." This is part of how we are, and it's always there. And it's a challenge not to look inside the organism and use that as the causal agent.
So I got a funny story about this. My undergraduate professor, Dr. Rodney Clark, so it's a shout out, he retired this past year. We used to wear the rat lab, and he would flip out on anybody that said that the rat knew to press the lever, they knew they were going to get water. And he told me later on, he goes, "I get mad at people who say that. One, we're part of a verbal community, so I'm trying to not establish that. But until you understand what you're really saying, even though you're using the short end of no, you can't do it." As I'm older, I was allowed to say that because I had a learning history that the internal was not, that's just me shorthanding, say, I established a situation where the rat pressed the lever, was reinforced, so that became an SDM. I mean, we can go into that whole process, but I used it as a shorthand. So what I think is important to understand is you can use these shorthand things a little bit, especially with a community that understands what you're going for. But the hard part is making sure that you're being a little bit more technical with fields that don't share how you approach those internal things. Saying somebody knows something, saying there's some memory, saying there's some other things to certain fields, they're going to take it down a whole nother path. So yes, it's hard, Rick. And I'm not going to sit at ABA with someone and make sure that I'm so technically correct because they're probably going to make fun of me anyway. But it's when we are talking to others, understanding if you're going to use shorthand, that you better be able to explain it a little bit more, just because it places the onus of behavior on the environment and how we arrange things, rather than focusing on that individual as it's their fault or it's their problem and they need to change. And it's looking at teaching, looking at clients in different settings. We need to be thinking about what we can do to help them, sitting there and yelling at them, do you know how to do this? Do it better, is not how we do it.
Yeah. Well, that's a great story about Rod and being able to shape up and give those life lessons. We all have had experience those, like data plural and people not using the R with it. You know, this is those little things that help. But when you talk to parents, you can shorthand it as long as you know what you're talking about. If anyone's interested in how this whole thing is elevated, just look at cognitive psychology. There's a whole entire field of internal causes. And, you can read their journal articles and what's the causal agent. Some people are still talking about the mind. The mind is a very real thing. What the mind is, well, people can try to describe it in some way, or maybe they'll say, well, that's just a placeholder. But that's not the way a science should move forward. And thinking about that, when I talk with my colleagues and we're talking about how do you come to understand the world, I very much object to cognitive psychology in the way they are trying to look at these inner causes. And again, it's okay, like we were saying in the last segment, to argue when it comes to science. This is us trying to understand. And Skinner, like one of the things that they said in this box is read 1953 Science and Human Behavior, read 1974 about behaviorism. Skinner spent so much of his time just trying to explain what is behavior and how we can be more fruitful as behavioral scientists, not looking at inner causes.
I think that brings us to our third word.
Okay.
And that word is works. Just W-O-R-K. Works.
There is a lot of work to do.
That is not an inner cause that I know.
No. Very clever. Doug, this brings us to the end. I have enjoyed reading these boxes. There was a few other ones that we read that we don't have time to talk about. But let me encourage all the listeners, if this book is something that you haven't read yet, put it in your professional library. You will not, you'll be very happy to start reading this. And it's great when you read these books with other folks. If you haven't read this book, if you have a book reading club, read a chapter a week or 2 weeks, whatever it is, and you will be enlightened by many of the ideas if you haven't read this book. At least that's my personal experience with it.
I was going to say, I advise everyone who does behavioral research, every behavior analyst, have this book. If nothing else, read the boxes. Challenge yourself. This is challenging because not everything is approached this way in our field. And we need to be striving as a scientist to be more scientific in this process. So I can't advise you enough to read it.
Well, on that note, let me thank everyone for joining us today on ABA On Call.
Thanks for watching this episode of ABA On Call. To get your CEU, follow the link and instructions below the video. You can enjoy the program again there, or you can go straight to the attendance verification quiz. Just enter the secret words and pay the CEU fee to generate your certificate.